Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi, and we're delighted to be on the second day of our Twin Cities Book Festival. It's the 20th year for Rain Taxi to do this. It's a bit of an outlier doing it virtually, but we're having a lot of fun, and we hope you are too. Don't forget that there are 19 author sessions like this one to check out. We also have a handful more pre-recorded sessions in our Minnesota author mashup and our new chapbook launch, as well as a fantastic exhibit hall online for you to check out with publishers, organizations, and authors who have a lot of great stuff to share with you this year. We know if you look around the festival, enjoy all the elements of it, there's a lot to have fun. Right now, I'm delighted to introduce this panel, which is magical middle grade graphic novels. I love all 5 of those words. The authors joining us today are David Bowles. David is the award-winning Mexican-American author of many books for young people. He has several new books out this year, actually, but today we're focusing on Tales of the Feathered Serpent, Rise of the Halfling King, a new graphic novel that follows the adventures of a magical boy from Maya mythology. We also have Kathleen Gros with us, coming from Vancouver, British Columbia. Kathleen's latest release is the modern-day graphic novel adaptation of Little Women called Jo. And Tim Probert is here from New York. Tim not only does bookwork, but animation and art direction, and he's celebrating his debut graphic novel, Lightfall, the Girl the Galdurian. Moderating our session is our own Linda Stack Nelson, Rain Taxi's trusty editorial assistant, and Linda has been instrumental in bringing you this entire festival. She has an abiding passion for children's literature, so I'm really delighted that she can be the one to lead us through this group. Let me remind all our audience members that you can ask questions at the bottom. You can buy books by these authors using that link. You can donate to Rain Taxi if you so choose. We are a nonprofit, and every dollar we receive during this festival goes toward helping us create another festival in 2021, whatever it may look like. Thanks for joining us, and take it away, Linda.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank everybody for being here with us today. I'm excited for all of the panels that I'm doing this weekend, but graphic novels have always been one of my favorite mediums. I think that they are just so versatile and so great for young readers, and I could not be more excited about this trio of people to have for graphic novels because you all have such different ones, and I can't wait to talk about how they're different and how they're similar and how wonderful they all are. But first, for those in the audience who haven't been lucky enough like me to read all of these beautiful novels already, I would love to have everybody introduce themselves and just say the dreaded a little bit about their book. And I asked you ahead of time if you could find one panel that you really love to show the audience, because I think it doesn't make any sense to talk about a graphic novel and not know what it looks like. So I would love to just hear a little bit and see a little bit, and that way everybody else can too. So Kathleen, do you mind jumping in first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Kathleen, and my book is called Jo, an adaptation of Little Women, sort of. And it's a modern-day reinterpretation of the classic American novel, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And I've reimagined it so that the four March sisters are in various grades in middle school and high school, and it sort of follows them through a school year in their life and all the sort of ups and downs. And I've also reinterpreted it through a queer lens, which is, sort of what I'm into, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so my favorite, I had to pick 2 pages. I feel like, I don't know, there are so many spreads in this book that I really like, but this is one of my favorite pages in the book because I feel like the colors turned out really good. And then because we're in October, also there's a whole chapter on Halloween, and I wanted to show a seasonally fall appropriate page with some pumpkins because October is my favorite month.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've been following your on Instagram the spooky drawings that you've been doing all month. And October is also one of my favorite months. I mean I'm an October baby, so I'm biased, but I also love Halloween. So there we go. Awesome. Thank you so much. Tim, do you mind jumping on next?
Sure. So my book is called Lightfall, the Girl the Galdurian. It's a fantasy adventure story with a little humor thrown in, and it follows the story of Bee, who's a young girl who is a little anxious and a little hesitant, and she by chance meets this guy Cad, who's a Galdurian, which is this ancient race of giant kind of amphibious dudes who have disappeared for hundreds of years, and her grandfather goes missing, and they team up to go find him. And then they get into all sorts of hijinks and adventures. I will find my page for you. So I always liked this one quite a bit. It's cheating because it's a whole page, but it just kind of gets the tone of the book of like two strangers becoming friends and wandering through magical woods, which is kind of a lot of the book.
Yeah, your book is so whimsical and so fun. I read it before it started snowing here. I read it sitting outside on a blanket as I did all three of these in one afternoon, and it just felt like the perfect, like, sitting out under a tree kind of a book. So. All right, great. David, certainly last, but certainly also not least.
Thanks. Yeah, so this first book in the series called Tales of the Feathered Serpent, which are adaptations, graphic novel adaptations of Aztec and Maya myths from my book Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky. We see the tale of a half Alush, which is like a Maya elf, half human boy who is hatched from an egg, as one is, right? I mean, it's the way it's the way life begins, and is raised by a kindly witch. And pretty soon it becomes apparent, if hatching from an egg and being able to talk at the moment of birth weren't enough, he certainly shows an adeptness for magic, and it turns out that he is destined to fulfill a prophecy about overthrowing an evil king and becoming the new ruler that will bring humans and Lucius together. And so it's a fun adventure with lots of humor and so forth. And here are a couple of one of the things I love about it is the relationship between the halfling boy and his grandmother, and here we see them. We see her like teaching him how to call down rain, and he's like studying how to recombine ancient spells in new ways, which help him when he's got to later fight a massive snake from the underworld to make the dead come back and attack it. It's really a fun scene where you have all these basically like mummies punching a big underworld snake. So it was a lot of fun to do. To take a story from a people that used a blend of like a writing and art to tell their stories, and to do something like that with Graphica today to retell it.
That scene is so fun and has so much action in just a few panels. But I love that you pointed out the thing about him and his grandma being mirrored, because I noticed that in a few places in the book where they would be doing similar things, even if it wasn't exactly at the same time. And I thought that was just, I grew up with my grandparents as a big part of my immediate family. And I feel like that was I didn't even think about it until I saw the panels, which is what great art makes you do. But when I saw it, I was immediately called back to like actively imitating my grandma while she washed dishes, which is not as exciting by any means as learning how to raise the dead. But, we take what we can get.
Yes. There's a magic washing after.
Yes, there's a magic to everything. Exactly. And actually what you said leads perfectly into the question that I was going to ask next, which is about why graphic novels and what drew you to graphic novels. And obviously, Tim and Kathleen, you both work very strongly in cartooning specifically, but David, I know you've written prose and poetry in the past. And I loved your note at the end of the book about why you chose to do this as a graphic novel and about that. So I would love if you would just talk a little bit about that, and then we can have the other two of you talk about graphic novels and why they're the bomb also.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I grew up with comic books and what are called in Mexico historietas, which are basically the same kind of thing. And we cross the border to visit relatives and buy those at, like really like pulpy, done really on the fly, full of adventure and humor. And so even though life took me down the like more prose and poetic channels, I always kind of wanted to do something in this space, and it was a great opportunity when, because of the success of Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, and the need for like accessible middle grade retellings of these stories, we were able to do this because, again, as I talk about in the note, Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican ways of communicating were very, very visual. The Aztecs did not have a writing system, although the Maya did. But both of those civilizations and many other indigenous civilizations and what's now Mexico used that combination of like glyphs, whether they were, a full phonetic system like the Maya had, or whether they were just more like iconographical like the Aztecs had, and retelling stories in a way that kind of like echoes that. Like, this really felt right for me. And the other really cool thing was I was able to work with my daughter. So my daughter is an illustrator, and when the publisher asked whether I'd be willing to do this, to do 10 books, I was in the midst of like all these other projects with HarperCollins and Penguin Random House, and I was like, well, I'll tell you what, I'd be willing to do it, but I have a request. Will you consider an illustrator that I select for this first book? And they're like, well, sure. And I'm like, here's her art and so forth. And she's my daughter. So it was cool to get to work with my daughter. It was a very lovely experience. And yeah,
and the art is just gorgeous. I mean, your daughter did a great job. We originally were sort of hoping we could also get her in here because we thought it'd be cool to have you both, but everyone can enjoy and appreciate this, like this page that you showed us before, for instance, from home, hopefully, and we'll hopefully go grab a copy of the book so that they can see it and appreciate it in their hands. But anyway, Tim and Kathleen, I'll toss it to Kathleen first. What drew you to either graphic novels or comics in general as a form earlier on, or did you have a first favorite graphic novel?
Yeah, for me, like I've always drawn comics, even before I really knew what comics were. Like the marrying of like image and word and storytelling is just like innate for me in many ways. Like it feels like the most natural way to express myself. And yeah, for sure, I just feel like it's like the most honest way I communicate, maybe. In some ways, like it feels like a calling more than anything else to work in comics. It's like, even if nobody's looking at what I'm doing, I still got to do it. Like it's just the way I feel most at home in like telling a story. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure my exposure to comics is probably similar to a lot of people's. Like Archie comics at the grocery store was super accessible. And then I was gifted Thieves and Kings by Mark Oakley. I remember for like my 8th birthday, and that was like when I really fell in love with graphic novels. And I was like, I have to make something like this too.
I spent what I now consider to be a horrifying amount of money that I made pet sitting when I was between the ages of like 7 and 13 on Archie comics. And I truly think I could have financed my college education with the money that I spent. Like I have trunks of comics that I bought during that time. And like, I don't regret it. Obviously we're on the same page about that, but I very much identify with that. And I went to Borders and cleaned them out many a time for their Archie comic selection.
Yeah, we got a lot of ours via garage sales, where another family in the neighborhood would be getting rid of a gigantic box of Archie comics, and they were like, $5, it's yours. And then we'd go like 50 Archie comics, and our parents would be like, okay.
Yeah, yep. Those are, that trunk is at my mom's house, and every once in a while she's like, do you want to take these somewhere? And I'm like, no, those live there. You can keep those. Anyway, sorry, Tim, tell us about comics.
Sure. I mean, for me, it's I love drawing and I love writing, so it's the ultimate combination. And it feels very direct to me to just be able to like I write it as a script and then to just draw it, and then there it is on the page, and it feels kind of pure, I think, in a way that like, so I work in animation as my during the day, my day job, which I love, but you know, sometimes you go through these many phases, and it can sort of shift and change, whereas like when I'm working on comics, it's just what I draw and then it's done, which is fun for me. And I think it was when I first read Bone that I kind of like put together in my head that I love these stories like Lord of the Rings and these big fantasy epics, and then seeing that done in this visual format was like eye-opening, and like, oh, I want to do that. I want to do that. Yeah. What a great medium to try and do it in. So it's always kind of been like around in the back of my head, and then slowly I've been building towards it. And then, yeah, this is my first big project in that field. So.
Well, we're super excited that you're sharing it with us. It's a gorgeous book. I was lucky enough to get the hardcover, and I just have to like take the cover off and show the camera for a second, because the hardcover is just drop dead gorgeous. It's got like this faux engraving kind of.
Yeah.
That I just absolutely was stunned by. And the cat is stunned by it too, clearly. No, we're never mad about a cat here. So the question that I had next is sort of related actually to what you were just talking about, Tim, with writing the script and then creating the images, which is the source material for all three of these books is really different because, you know, you, Tim, were creating basically a completely brand new imaginary world from scratch. Mm-hmm. And Kathleen, you're adapting a classic novel. And then David, yours is also an adaptation, but of more of a folktale. So you're not working necessarily from like one standard published by 1,000 presses 1,000 times text. So I'm just sort of, I want to hear a little bit about like how you chose the structures that you chose and how you came from either original text or a completely imaginary world to finished beautiful book products. David, do you mind going first again?
Yeah, of course. So when I was doing the original prose version of this as part of Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, I started with the two existing, like I guess you could say, like original sources, which are literally an English and a Spanish transcription from the 17th and 18th century of Mayan informants telling the story to someone. An outsider, an archaeologist, anthropologist, whatever, and then using those and a couple of variants that were recorded after that, I went down to the Yucatan Peninsula where the story is from, because it's centered in the city of Uxmal, which are now, they're like basically ruins that are about an hour from the more famous Chichen Itza. And visiting the ruins and getting a feel for what it was like, and then going to the small towns around and talking to people and asking them in Spanish, do you know the story of what was called the Dwarf King of Uxmal, El Rey Enano de Uxmal? And a couple, usually older people, would be like, oh yes, I heard the story when I was young, and then I would ask if I could record it, so then I could like add texture of like modern oral versions of it, and that's how I crafted the original prose version. But then to go from that prose to Graphica, that is interesting. And I had been working already for a while on a previous graphic novel script for the series that's coming out starting next year called Clockwork Curandera, that Raul Gonzalez, Raul III, who does the Lowriders middle grade graphic novels, is the illustrator on. And so I had already cut my teeth in figuring out, the format and how to tell stories in that way, which is very different. I've been a prose writer for forever. And though I had like a kind of instinctual sense for the way panels should be arranged on the page, just from like being a reader of it, I had to learn a lot. It is not, there is a learning curve. It's kind of steep. But I found ways to figure out what needed to be on the page. But because I was writing for a middle grade audience, I knew I needed to bring in some more things. So I decided to bring in an animal sidekick, because hey, what's a young person's adventure without an animal sidekick, right? So I was like,
everybody loves animals.
Everyone loves animals. So I one of the most common animals that would be friendly to humans in southern Mexico is the spider monkey, and so we brought in a spider monkey and named him Mash. It's Maax. It looks like Max, but Mash is just Yucateco for spider monkey. So it's kind of it's like calling your dog, and then I realized that the original story, which is the story of the witch raising the boy, and then the boy sounding the kingmaker drum, which announces to the world that the guy who's going to be a rival to the king has arrived, and then the trials that he's got to go through to defeat the king. So that basic story, it could be told relatively easily in like 32 pages, and it needed it to be longer.
Sorry, I just wanted to show Mosh. He's so gosh darn cute.
He's a great character.
It's adorable.
So I had to, at the same time, expand the story. And so there's a variant version of the story from a little bit later that talks about this serpent from the underworld and how the dwarf king defeats him. And that's this serpent that you see kind of like wrapped around them on the cover. And there's Mosh right there. So I folded that in, and that was a great piece for like a lot of wordless adventure, because so much of the rest of it is, full of words and spells and, talking heads and stuff like that. And so it was nice to be able to have several pages of relatively, word-free adventure to take advantage of, what Graphica has to offer. And this is something that when you have a graphic novel, and my other two companions in this panel could speak to this from their different perspective. But when you have a different writer and illustrator, and the writer tends to be a prose writer, we overwrite. We put too much dialogue. We put too many words and panels. And I had to learn when Raul and I one time had dinner. We were both at the LA Times Festival of Books, and we had dinner together. And he's like, "Man, you're killing me. So you need to." You overdo it with the words. You like push every single panel to its maximum, and possible word count, and you need to like back off on it. I'm like, hey, let's cut stuff then. I'm down for that. I don't know. I'm the prose writer, and so like learning to do that was also really, really important.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be really challenging. I was definitely the person who would always turn in like papers that were half again as long as the professor told me to write, and I'd be like, I'm sorry that you have to read all this, but I'm not cutting it. So, so Kathleen, what was it like to adapt like one single existing text? Because unfortunately, unlike David, you couldn't really go do anthropological research, which that's so cool. Like, what an amazing way to be able to build a book and to get a sense of what the area looks and feels like.
Yeah, it was super interesting to hear about that process, David. So Joe is a loose adaptation for sure. So Little Women is one of my absolute like favorite all-time books, and I wound up reading it. I've read it a million times, and then I read it like multiple times as I was like working through it, thinking about adapting it. And what we know of as Little Women was actually originally published as two books. So the first half is Little Women, and then the second half is Good Wives. But it's published in America and Canada as one book. And the first part of Little Women follows the March sisters through a year of their life. It goes Christmas to Christmas, and that's sort of like how they grew up through that year. And then the second book sort of time jumps a little bit, and then it's like their adulthood, basically. So I kind of borrowed the structure of the first book and said, okay, well, a year is like a nice amount of time for a character to have like growth and work through themes and stuff. But I felt that Christmas to Christmas wasn't necessarily as relevant today as maybe it was in the mid 1800s. So I thought, like, when I was a kid, I never really thought about the calendar year. I thought about school years. So I brought in the kids sort of like first day of, for Jo, it's the first day of grade 8. And then it follows her throughout the school year. While I was adapting, there are scenes that are sort of reimaginings of what happened in the original book. And, adapting a novel is a tricky because you have to cut a lot. Like a lot. You have to boil it down to its very essence because, a 250-page graphic novel is, that's a limited amount of time to get a lot of information in there. And I really wanted to make sure that everything felt like developed and rich. And really my goal with the book was like Little Women as a book feels like a world I can step into. And I really wanted to bring that into my book as well. I hope I accomplished that in some way. So I really looked at each of the sisters and sort of isolated what I thought their emotional journey was through Little Women. So for Jo, at the core of the story, it's about her sort of like figuring out who she wants to be and who she is, as well as like finding her voice as a writer. So that theme, like very basically, is quite logical to bring into the present. So she's got a blog, and she's also like joined the newspaper club, but she's struggling because she always thought she was a good writer, but then when she's actually confronted with like having her work edited and submitting it to places, she's not doing very well. She really needs, the guidance of her editor to sort of like get her to be a stronger writer. And then of course, sort of like finding herself as, coming out and stuff like that. That's not really a spoiler, it's on the book jacket. And then, like Meg, she's the oldest sister, her thing is like coming into responsibility and sort of like maturing. So the other sisters take kind of a back seat in this book. Like Jo's really at the forefront. So Meg, it's kind of, she's, tutoring and like struggling with that a little bit, and then gets better. And then Beth, we did a little bit differently because in the original story, it's not a spoiler, this book is over 150 years old, dies, which is based on Louisa May Alcott's real life sister who died of congenital heart failure. I didn't feel necessarily that I was the right person to write a story about a terminal illness necessarily. So it's more about like Beth, coming into her own with music after having been sick for quite a lot of her childhood. Amy's my other favorite character in the book, and she's sort of like blossoming as an artist and also being a bit of a brat. So yeah, it's very loose, but it was kind of like trying to pull the basic ideas out of the book and seeing how that could work today, if that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah. I actually, I just sort of went in, and I haven't read Little Women in a long, long time, but when I got to the part where they were talking about Beth having been sick, I had a moment where I was like, doesn't she die in the original book? And then I was like, oh my gosh, is she gonna die? And I was not disappointed that you changed that in your adaptation. I will say that is more than fine with me. And I thought that I mean, having the other siblings take a little bit more of a backseat, I really felt not only helped with the size, because that was one of the things that I originally thought as well going into it is, like David was saying, there's just not as much space in a graphic novel for text. Like you just physically don't have the space to tell story in words the way you do in a 250-page novel. So
yeah, one sentence in a novel can be 3 pages in a graphic novel,
Exactly. Yeah.
How you're doing things.
Yeah. So that was something that I was very curious about how you would handle it. And I hadn't actively thought about the school year thing, but that's so true. Absolutely. Like, I think really only barely in the last year have I gotten out of even like that mindset of thinking of time in school years. So, and we did have an audience question where somebody asked if you had to get permission to adapt the book, but David has very wisely noted that Little Women is in the public domain. So I'm guessing you didn't really have any issues with that.
It's public domain, so we didn't have to talk to anyone. There's something to be said about, it's great while an artist is living for them to have complete control over their work, but there's also something really interesting about, 150 years later, trying to do something new with that work, because I do think the goal of adaptations is kind of to say something new or like highlight something different. Like you're trying to say something with an adaptation. So I think it's very interesting to be able to reframe work, later on.
Totally. I agree. I mean, I think it's sort of like covers of songs that sound like the exact same song, but sung by somebody else. I'm always like, I mean, if you want to sing the song, that's fine. But like, I don't necessarily want to listen to a cover, just that song, but you sang it. So I agree. I think your adaptation has a lot of the spirit of the original, but really does have something new. So thank you. And I'm just going to take a moment to shoot out if anybody else has questions for the panelists, whether it's relevant to what we've already talked about or just things you're wondering about in general about their books. You can toss them in the question box down below that says ask a question, or you can put them in the chat and our chat moderator can pop them on over as well. So, but Tim, let's hear, how did you create the vast and imaginative world that was Lightfall?
Yeah, I started it a long time ago. It was maybe seven or 8 years ago. I think I first started working on it. And I was originally developing it for animation to start, and went pretty far down that road, and didn't end up happening there. But I think I really learned a lot about what kind of story I wanted to tell and how I wanted to tell it, so that when it came time to do the graphic novel, I felt a little more clear and focused about what I wanted the story to be about. But along the way, I developed a bunch of the world and the characters and the environments and stuff. But I think the core of it for me has always been B and Kat's relationship, and also just dealing with anxiety. It's like a big theme of the book. So B is a very anxious kid, and that was just something I wanted to see realized in a fantasy adventure and like a big epic story, where instead of having your gung-ho Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker who just jump right into the adventure, someone who would react a bit more like I would, where they're like, I don't know, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe it's a little scary, but then, kind of working through it and doing it anyway. And then having this companion in Kat who is always jumping in head first, and, act first, think later kind of situation. And he brings out some things in her and she brings out things in him. So that's always kind of been the core of the story. And then as far as the world that's built around it is just whatever, it's stuff I like. Is a lot of it. It's giant crabs. That sounds fun. Let's put some of those in, and forests and ruins, and just building a lush world. And then working on backstory for the world is always so fun. Even if it doesn't make it into the book, it's just fun to do and to think about, and then have little bits of it put in there. So I'm always trying to pepper that into the story, but it's like David and Kathleen were just saying, that I always overwrite, and my script is for a 400-page graphic novel, and then you're constantly cutting and whittling it down to the core elements and the most direct story. Yeah, it was quite a process, but I enjoyed it.
It sounds like quite a process. When I first opened up Lightfall and saw the map at the beginning, I feel like all good fantasy books begin with a map. That's basically a prerequisite. And so when I saw the map, I was like, oh, this is going to be good. Yeah. So even if a book, even if all of what you came up with didn't make it into the book, I feel like we as readers still feel it, because you've put all that thought into it, and it in some ways enriches what you do, right? Even if it doesn't make it directly into our eyeballs. So.
Right. That was the goal. That was the hope.
Well, we have a very specific question from the chat for Kathleen, which is, how tall are the little women in Little Women?
That's a very strange question. That's a secret I'll take to my grave.
There you have it. Well, and especially, it's a whole year. They probably were different heights throughout the book. Most of them are still growing.
I was tempted tall enough to kick your butt, man.
And at least one of them would. Maybe not all of them would, but at least one of them would. Yeah.
Yeah, Amy's very scrappy. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, okay, this is also sort of, I think David touched on it earlier about what it's like writing for middle grade specifically and having to think about that. But that was also something that I wanted to talk with you all about, because middle grade is such a specific age range, and some things about it absolutely just transcend to the rest of our lives, I think, but some things about writing for middle grade, I'm sure, are very specific. So I would just be curious what your experience was like working for a middle grade audience specifically, and how you thought about that and how you structured your books and things like that. And I'll go in reverse order because I feel like I've been picking on David. And Tim, if you'll start.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because like you said, it is a very specific audience, but then at the same time, I think what I was always trying to do was make sure it was, age appropriate, but also not limited to a middle grade audience. So, I hope middle grade readers love the book, but I also wanted to make sure that it was something that, a college student could read, or an adult, or, even like some kids going slightly younger and reading it, and they might not, get quite everything, but still being able to like just enjoy the art and go on the adventure, and then maybe read it again when they're older and kind of like pick up a little bit more of it. So yeah, I don't think I've worked super specifically to middle grade. I mean, sometimes there would be notes from an editor just like, do you think that's like a little too subtle, or like something is not quite working for a younger reader? But I mean, I think kids are really smart and they get it. So, I think, also doing things like, like Maurice Sendak with Where the Wild Things Are, like not being afraid to be a little dark, be a little scary, like kids love that stuff. And I think it's great to read when you're younger. So I tried to put all that stuff in and yeah, not talk down to kids at all, but just be on their level, because we're all there. We've all been there. Yeah.
I like that you brought up not talking down to kids, because that's one of the things that I like the most about graphic novels as a format, actually, is that I think they do a really good job of like meeting anyone where they are. I think graphic novels, more than almost any other kind of writing, can really transcend age limits. And any of these books, I mean, obviously I enjoyed them as a 25-year-old, and I think a 50-year-old would enjoy them, and maybe even a 5-year-old with a very long attention span might enjoy them if they were read aloud. So I think that's one of the really great things that's slowly but surely being more and more recognized about graphic novels as well, with, like Jerry Craft winning the Newbery this past year. And there's just more and more, I think, appreciation and understanding for the art form and for the potential and respect that it deserves. So
definitely.
Yeah. What about you, Kathleen? Obviously a classic novel, but one that has been read by many middle grade readers prior to its graphicization.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel in some ways like perhaps I don't actually think about it that much while I'm writing. All of my writing experience is just like doing stuff. Like I've never taken writing classes or anything like that outside of like high school, basically. But I think I really, what I'm writing, I'm thinking about like who I was when I was 9 to 12, and like what was I reading then? And I tended to read up quite a bit, but yeah, and sort of like thinking about like what was I actually dealing with at that time in my life, because I think actually one of the things I do is I tend to write a little bit young, and often have to be told by an editor like, oh, can you actually that's sounding a little bit young, can we make that a little bit more mature? So I have to be reminded of that, and thinking about who I was when I was like 12 helps, because I'm like, oh yeah, if I'm thinking about a generic 12-year-old, I might not think about some of the things that I actually went through when I was 12, and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know, I just try my best, I guess.
So for me, middle grade is like something that I pretty intuitively understand. I was a middle school teacher for many, many years, and I've written a lot of stuff in that space. My Goddess of Twins series, just kind of like a Mexican-American, like Percy Jackson kind of thing, is middle grade. The book that I co-wrote with Adam Gidwitz, the Unicorn Rescue Society book for the Chupacabras of the Rio Grande, is also like middle grade, lower middle grade. So I have a real feel for the conflicts, which tend to be exterior. The fact that it's not so much about this like voyage of self-discovery, but more about finding your place in a group, finding your place in the community, like learning the role that you play. And those are all like really, really interesting things to me, coming from like a culture and ethnicity that's like really community-based and family-centered. And so I enjoy writing that space. I mean, I like doing YA stuff as well, but there's this really something cool about the team building and family and community kind of discovery that happens in middle grade. So that's something I really enjoyed. And the journey of Sayam, the halfling boy in this graphic novel, is reflects the kind of journey that I think a lot of kids in that age group go through. And it's the same thing that was in my book They Call Me Muerto, which is a novel in verse. It's just a space I inhabit really well, because I remember like what it was like to go through that, and like to really, really want to belong to community and to a group or whatever, and like grappling with my differences from the group and how that complicated that desire of mine. So middle grade's a great place to play around with those kinds of things.
I totally agree. And I think the distinction that you're pulling out about I think often YA and the experience of being a teenager to a certain extent tends to be a little bit more individual focused. And you don't seem to get as many sort of like cast driven books maybe, or like big group books, which, all of your books have several characters that are really important to the plot, and that there's not one person whose perspective we're exclusively getting in any of these. And so I think that's a really interesting distinction. I had never thought about it that way before. But we've got just a few more minutes on the panel, so get in any last minute questions that any of you may have. But I also, just as a final, sorry, I'm just taking a look at the question box before I get into my last question, because I don't want to step on anybody else who might have a question that's not just me continuing to mine all of you. Somebody, Rebecca, has asked in the question box, as you're writing the script for a graphic novel, do you have images in mind, or do the illustrations come later? Which might be a little bit different for David versus Tim and Kathleen, given that you have David to call somebody and be like, put this.
Yeah, no, but but still, you still are envisioning it. You still have to. You're writing a script. The script is to communicate with the illustrator, so you have to break it out into panels and talk about what you imagine in those panels. You may not have like the specifics of character design in mind, because you trust your illustrator, but you certainly do have to understand the dynamics of panels and what can be left in the gutter, and how to place scenes, and who to have on the left if you've got dialogue, and who to have on the right. And I mean, you've got to be able to imagine all those things. And so, to some degree, to a limited degree, you do have those images in mind when you're writing the scripts.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I try and write very visually, so that when I go back to it later, if I haven't like drawn a little thumbnail next to it to remember what it was I was thinking, like hopefully the writing will spark in my mind again what I was thinking about when I wrote it.
I definitely I have like the book playing like a movie in my head, basically, like while I'm writing. And I feel like in my scripts, because I'm the artist, I don't always put as much like visual information to the script, because I'm like, I know what that is. But like for Joe, I knew immediately what type of house they were going to live in, and it's based off of a very specific build of house and stuff, and sort of like I just get the feel immediately of what the world is like, and I sort of know what the spaces the characters are going to move through are going to look like.
All right, well, we're getting close to the end. Everybody should go buy all of these gorgeous books from our independent bookselling partner, Red Balloon Bookshop here in the Twin Cities, which there's a button below your screen that you can use to do that. And David and Tim, both of your books are the first in a series, and so there will be many more to come if you acquire them. Kathleen, I don't know if you have another wonderful adaptation coming up.
Yeah, well, Joe is standalone so far, but I have another sort of adaptation coming down the line in the next couple of years. It's coming out in 2022. So yeah, it's a Anne of Green Gables adaptation for the modern day. So.
Exciting. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Keep an eye out for all of those amazing books still to come. I'm doing another panel right after this if you want to come hear about some YA books. And then there's another graphic novel panel that I'm doing on Saturday. If you want to join me at 11:30 on Saturday to do more graphic novels, we're going to be here doing that too. So check out the rest of the festival, grab your books, and thanks again so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.